It's 9 p.m. here in the French capital. You're watching live from Paris on France 24. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. These are the headlines. France's lower house of parliament approves a new law which aims to uphold secularism whilst tackling what the government calls Islamist separatism. A Dutch court orders an end to the 3-week-old COVID curfew, saying that the Prime Minister has no right to use emergency powers. Well, the government says it'll appeal that ruling. And if you've ever wanted to become an astronaut, this could be your chance because the European Space Agency is recruiting. We'll talk you through the application process. Good evening. France's lower house of parliament has today approved a new law which aims to uphold French values and secularism whilst tackling what the government has called Islamist separatism. Well, the issue gained new urgency back in October after a teacher was beheaded in the Paris suburbs. Well, lawmakers voted 347 in favour and 151 against that new legislation, whilst 65 abstained. Well, let's get some more analysis now. And we can speak to Joseph Downing, who's a terrorism expert and a fellow at the European Institute at London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Is this new law likely to have the desired effect?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the key issues, right, is there's already plenty of laws on the statute books in France that cover these measures. So, I mean, to me, what effect it's going to have remains quite unclear. I mean, it seems to me to adopt a model of radicalisation that's about 20 to 30 years out of date. It's unclear to me that there's any evidence that people are being radicalised in voluntary associations or mosques in France. It seems to me that they're being radicalised more on the internet or in small groups of people operating outside the realms of kind of normal society. Muslim communities in France have been very good at removing extremists from mosques and from voluntary associations. So to me, it remains unclear.
And there's a risk attached to it, isn't there? That is that it risks stigmatising and further alienating a sizable chunk of the French population.
Yeah, completely. And also, I mean, the problem is in France, there's a very active anarchist, far left, far right groups who are anti-state, who, you know, seek to overthrow capitalism and all of these kinds of goals, who are not named in this separatism bill. And that, to me, I think is an issue, right? Because there are many different groups who, in a sense, seek to be sort of politically separate, right, from mainstream French society. And they're not being covered by this bill, which I think is extremely problematic. To me, having lived and worked on this issue in France for more than a decade, there isn't a grassroots integration problem, right? Muslim communities in France, it's shown by large-scale surveys, do not want to be separate from French society, and the lived experience is they're very much not. It's been estimated that as much as 10 times more numbers of French Muslims serve in the French army than have ever committed any violent extremism, for example.
You mentioned, the French context. I mean, do you think this is more of a French issue than it is for other countries in the European Union? And if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, I don't think it's more necessarily of a French issue. I think it's more of an electoral issue from a candidate who is fearing really running against the far right again, and who knows there's no point in him courting more left-wing voters because they just basically don't like him. And for Macron and his government, it's much easier to bring this issue out. It's much more difficult to fail on this issue than it is to fail on things that he's already promised and failed on, such as reform, tackling unemployment, and dealing with the sort of malaise of the French economy. I think for him, this is clearly about political capital, because there are already laws on the books against polygamy, right? There are already laws on the books that enshrine secularism. There are already laws on the books that forbid forced marriage. So to me, this seems like a really, in many ways, an unreasonable duplication of legislation.
Okay, so you seem to be the school of thought of quite a lot of people in the commentators' sort of community here in France to say this is President Macron's bid to win over far-right voters from Marine Le Pen, given that there's an election, not immediately, but in the next couple of years. Do you think there are other approaches that perhaps would be more more effective at tackling this problem than unveiling more laws. What else could the government be doing that you think would probably be more effective and more useful?
Well, I mean, I think a good start would be to abandon the rhetoric, really, that there's a war and there's a disintegration, a lack of integration, or a separatism kind of issue. The lived experience on the streets of France, to me, and in my research, the data that I come across and the people that I speak to, there isn't the separatism, disintegration issue, right? That I think is the first step, is to reframe how this entire debate is done. And then I think if the French government is serious about stopping things like the Bataclan attack, things like Charlie Hebdo. I mean, it's interesting to note that the Charlie Hebdo attackers radicalized with a group who used to exercise in a park in Paris and not in a mosque and not in a non-governmental voluntary sector organization. They would do better to tackle organized crime in France and also especially the proliferation of heavy-grade military weapons on the streets of French cities, where, I mean, in Marseille, you can purchase a Kalashnikov on a housing estate for around €1,000 and below. These are kinds of things, I think, if the government is interested in stability and peace, these are things that they should be tackling. But they're much harder to tackle, right? And this, I think, is the problem.
Yeah, and of course the context of this law was that it was, it came back to the forefront after the killing of Samuel Paty, who wasn't killed with an automatic weapon. He was beheaded in front of a school. And the context of all of that was the dialogue, really, and some of it online, amongst sort of parent-teacher associations, parents who were parents of the school. It wasn't really a formal organisation, but the kind of organisation that this law would want to target and make sure that, people didn't see things the way the parents in that particular case saw them. I mean, do you think, therefore, in that context, this law could serve a useful purpose?
I think it's interesting because I think that this is the interesting aspect of this, right? I mean, this is obviously what happened to this poor teacher is deplorable, right? And I don't think this has popular support amongst French Muslims at all. But it's worth considering here the role of perhaps social media and technology, and how apps like Telegram, apps like Signal that are very popular in France have got encryption that doesn't allow law enforcement to get access to data, right? So people like the Islamic State have used apps like Telegram very readily to broadcast radical sort of propaganda and radical material to French citizens anonymously. And this, to me, I think is absent from the bill, right? This discussion of the role of technology in these processes is absent from these laws, and I think is a much bigger issue than the voluntary sector organisations, which are generally banal and generally actually work for French integration and not disintegration.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but I'd love to talk to you for longer. Thank you so much, Joseph Downing, terrorism expert and fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed. The French health authorities have announced the latest COVID-19 numbers. There have been 19,590 new confirmed cases in the last 24 hours, as well as 586 COVID-related deaths. The latest number of people to have been vaccinated here in France now stands at just under 3.2 million. There you can see it's exactly 3.16 million people who've had one shot since the start of the rollout of the campaign. Now, in the Netherlands, the Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, has today been calling on the country to continue observing an overnight curfew to stop the spread of COVID-19. That's despite a court ruling earlier in the day which said that the government had failed to make it clear why it's using emergency powers. Well, this is the first curfew the country's had since the Second World War, and when it was introduced in late January, it triggered several days of riots. France 24's Luke Schrago has more.
A blow for the Dutch government in its fight against the coronavirus, after the Hague District Court ruled its nighttime curfew, the first since the Second World War, had no legal basis.
De maatregel van de avondklok is gebaseerd op een wet die bedoeld is voor superspoedeisende gevallen. Denk aan een dijkdoorbraak, aan gevallen waarin de regering niet eerst met het parlement kan overleggen om een wet op te stellen. Over die maatregel van de avondklok, daar was al over gesproken, daar is zelfs over gedebatteerd met de Kamer, en dan verhoudt zich dat niet meer tot superspoed.
While generally adhered to, the curfew sparked the Netherlands' most serious rioting in 4 decades on its introduction in late January. The government last week extended it until March the 3rd, with the group behind the legal appeal against the curfew accusing the authorities of contempt.
Hij is ingevoerd op een oneigenlijke, ondemocratische en nu dus ook onwettige manier. Grappig om de reactie te zien van de overheid. Dit is een slechte verliezer. Ze verliezen namelijk niet zo vaak.
The government, though, is urging people to stick to the terms of the curfew, saying the measure is still necessary.
De avondklok is een middel. De avondklok is geen doel. En het doel is om het virus, het coronavirus, om dat zoveel mogelijk onder controle te houden. Zodat we straks al onze vrijheden weer terugkrijgen, maar dan wel op een veilige manier.
It opens another front for the government, one facing an election in less than a month after it resigned in January over a child benefits scandal.
Now, dozens of people in Yemen are reported to have been killed during the course of the last 24 hours alone. This as Houthi rebel fighters continue their advance on Marib, prompting thousands to flee the city of 2 million people. Well, many internally displaced Yemenis sought sanctuary in Marib, having fled other parts of the country at various stages of this 6-year-old conflict. Meanwhile, Washington is calling on the Houthis to halt their offensive and join international efforts to find a political solution. Well, as of today, the US no longer regards the Houthis as being a foreign terrorist organisation. France 24's Delano de Souza tells us more about just who the Houthis are.
Politically active in Yemen since 2003, the Houthis shot to international prominence nearly a decade later, capturing Sana'a at the end of 2014. The pressure resulted in Yemen's president stepping down and fleeing to neighbouring Saudi Arabia. If Riyadh accepted Houthi control of Yemen, it would mean allowing a hostile neighbour at its southern border. Houthis belong to the Shiite branch of Islam and make up roughly 35% of Yemen's population. Rebels are backed by Saudi's arch-rival in the region and have reportedly received military support from Iran. Saudi Arabia entered the Yemeni conflict in 2015 with a coalition of Arab states, including the UAE. Their aim was to reinstate the government of Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi. While the internationally recognized president is now based in the south, who controls what in Yemen has markedly changed. In recent years, Houthi rebels have expanded their territorial reach, taking populous and strategic parts of the country, including the port of Hodeidah. The Saudi-led coalition's bombing campaign has worsened a humanitarian situation that was already dire. Over 80% of Yemen's population is now reliant on international aid, with nearly 15 million people on the brink of famine. Fearing the humanitarian situation could worsen further, Joe Biden revoked the last-minute terrorist designation the Houthis had been given by his predecessor. The US president also halted American support for the war in Yemen, moves welcomed by the Houthis.
A little earlier, I spoke to Yemen expert Dr. Elizabeth Kendall at Oxford University. She gave us some of her insights on the situation there in Yemen.
Things are getting worse, and that despite the hope that came with the new Biden administration. What's happening at the moment is that we've seen a massive escalation in Houthi hostilities, not only lobbing drones and missiles inside Saudi Arabia itself, but of course, as your report just said, on the ground in Ma'rib. And this offensive in Ma'rib is really important in 2 or maybe 3 ways. It's strategically, Ma'rib is where the oil resources are, it has gas resources, and there's been a lot of investment there. So strategically, it's very important. And symbolically, it was an early success story in the war. People were fleeing to Ma'rib, not from it. So it was a model of stability. It's really upsetting to see that change. And then finally, the humanitarian catastrophe. Yes, the UN said yesterday that if this offensive continues, if there's an advance on Ma'rib city, it could endanger 2 million civilians, and it could displace people who've already been displaced, perhaps 2 or 3 times already. So it really is very significant what's happening now.
Indeed. I mean, the US State Department saying, and I quote, it's deeply troubled by the continued Houthi attacks. I mean, are the Houthis more likely to listen to what Washington is asking or saying now that they're no longer designated as being a terrorist organization? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that, of course, is the precise dilemma. How do you get the Houthis into a negotiating dialogue without, at the same time, empowering them? And we have seen some significant policy shifts by the United States, which we had hoped might put the Houthis into a position where they could start to get towards finding a peaceful compromise. And that seems very idealistic indeed. But, you know, their foreign terrorist organization designation was revoked. The US also withdrew support from Saudi offensive operations and halted some arms sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and has a clear statement of its wish to start finally to end the war. But I think the Houthis are perhaps taking this as a sign of weakness. A cynical interpretation would be that, well, the support is being withdrawn from the Saudi coalition and that international appetite for the war is waning. And there could also be a spoiler element to this. Don't forget, there are many leaders, some actually on the other side as well, who are getting rich on the war and don't want negotiations to work. And then perhaps there's also an element of the standard prelude to negotiations, where there's some leverage that could be gained from last-minute pushes. And perhaps this is no more than just trying to get into the strongest position before negotiations happen. We have to hope it's the latter.
Absolutely. I mean, Dr. Kendall, it really looks like the Houthis are trying to use Marib as a bargaining chip ahead of those negotiations. But I just want to ask you, I mean, what's your perspective on the Houthis as a unit? Because we have read reports, we've heard that perhaps they're not as united as they were, and perhaps there are sort of breakaway, more hardline elements in their ranks. Are those reports true?
I think it's definitely true that there are fractures in the Houthi ranks, as there are in all sides in this war. The coalition forces are not simply a mass of supportive militias who are totally on the side of the government either. They're more anti-Houthi than they are pro-government. And the same will be true of the Houthi side. I think it's important to remember that on the Houthi side, we have a mass of men who have been at war for altogether now over 16 years on and off since 2004, not just the most recent war. So ending that kind of way of life is going to be immensely difficult. I don't think we can hope for peace or peace negotiations soon. The most we could possibly expect in the short term is that some kind of ceasefire can be negotiated that allows the space for a pathway to be made towards negotiations.
And just lastly, I mean, we've touched on this already. I mean, the situation in Yemen is absolutely catastrophic. I mean, everyone knows the numbers, 80% of the population in need of aid, the country on the brink of total famine. There's COVID, there's cholera. Supposing the fighting did end or could end, who can fix this country?
Well, that's the $60 million question. It's very tempting to say America can do it, or the Biden administration, or the very many international actors involved in this. But ultimately, of course, this was a domestically generated conflict, and ultimately, Yemenis are going to have to solve it themselves. Now, this can be helped along by internationally led dialogues and mechanisms, but it will be the very many warring sides in Yemen, not just the main two, who will need to get together and solve this.
And that was Dr. Elizabeth Kendall at Oxford University speaking to me a little earlier on. Now, on a lighter note, perhaps like me, you've always secretly wanted to be an astronaut. Well, this could be your chance, because the European Space Agency is currently recruiting, and it's the first time that's happened in 11 years. Well, if you're interested, you've got from late March until late May to apply. Well, earlier we spoke to the French astronaut Thomas Pesquet. Here's what he told us.
For our selection, we had one woman out of 6 astronauts, which is roughly 15%. But if you look at the applicants, we had roughly 15%, 1.5 women applicants. So we want to start with increasing this drastically. We want women, girls to apply because we know they're qualified. So and once we do this, then hopefully we get 50% women and men for that selection. NASA did it a few years back, and that astronaut class has been doing splendidly in space and on the ground. So we want to do the same. I hope we can achieve it, but I can't encourage women enough to apply because it's a great career for women as well.